Good morning, dear students. Today we will discuss experimental research. In our last video, we discussed what experimental research basically is. Let us revise it. Let us have a quick revision in just 1 minute and then we'll start further. Experiment basically is a research investigation in which conditions are controlled, and we always have at least one independent variable which is being manipulated. Then its effect on a dependent variable is measured. Dependent variable is the one which is not being manipulated by the experimenter, and it is all done to test a hypothesis. Then basic issues are manipulation of independent variable is done, selection of dependent variable is important here, and assignment of subjects unit is important. Test units are basically, these can be in individual households, single companies, organizations, or maybe a group of companies, maybe all the companies in one industry, right? So test unit is important because we are actually doing the experiment on that particular test unit. When we talk about individuals test as test unit, that means individual person is going to be the subject of the experiment. But when we talk about the companies, when we talk about corporate sector, in that case we are talking about corporates as one test units. Then control over extraneous variables. We discussed in detail that what extraneous variables are and how to control them. Extraneous variables are basically those variables which directly or indirectly impact independent variable, so distorting the result of experiment which we might want to observe, because we are trying to manipulate independent variable so as to check its impact on dependent variable, but we get to see some impact of other variables as well. These are called extraneous variables, so we just control them with the help of some techniques, or we try to avoid their contribution. It cannot be removed 100%, but it can be minimized up to the maximum. So today let's start with demand characteristics. What do you mean demand? Sometimes experimental procedures that intentionally hint to subjects something about the experimenter's hypothesis means. Demand characteristics are situational aspects of the experiment that demand that the participant respond in one particular way. Sometimes experimenter directly or indirectly show that to the respondent that he wants answers of such and such things and he should behave this way. Hence the demand characteristics are a source of constant error, because the experimenter is demanding something from the respondent indirectly. So when if participant has recognized the experimenter's expectation or say his demand of the way he should behave, they are likely to act in a manner consistent with the experimental treatment. Even slight non-verbal cues sometimes give them the hints. So when the experimenter's influence is there on subject's reaction, this is basically a demand characteristic. In most of the experiments, the most prominent demand characteristic is the person who actually administers the experimental procedures, because that is the only person who is going to affect the subject, because he is in constant touch with the subject. All other, maybe if there is a team of experimenters, even then the person who is getting in touch with subject would be affecting the experiment the most. If an experimenter's presence, actions, or comment influence the subject's response in one or the other way, the subject's behavior in one or the other way, then that is actually called experimenter bias, because experimenter is creating that particular bias. Let us discuss the biases which comes through demand characteristics. Number one, Genoa-Pig effect, and number two, Hawthorne effect. What is Genoa-Pig effect? This attitude change of subject is basically Genoa-Pig, which we say that when the experimenter is directly or indirectly influencing subject's behavior towards the experiment, that is basically called Genoa-Pig effect. because we feel like that the person is behaving like, the way we want the person to respond. For example, now, if a subject in a sex discrimination experiment understand that the experimenter is interested in whether they change their attitudes in accord with the given characteristics of a job applicant, they may answer in a desired direction to please the experimenter. This is basically more or less social desirability bias as well, but it's more towards moving, just changing the answers with experimenters presence, because social desirability bias is somehow related to you being more social, you trying to show something positive in you. You are trying to show that you behave very well in the society, you are a positive person. But when we talk about demand characteristics here, experimenter is indirectly demanding the respondent or maybe the subject to behave in one particular way. And when this behavior is actually changed, their attitude is changed, this is called Gini mapping effect. Then Hawthorne effect. What do you mean by Hawthorne effect? The students who have studied management must have read about it in detail, because Hawthorne effect basically is discussed in management principles as well. Hawthorne effect is like researchers were attempting to study the effects on productivity of various working conditions such as hours of work, rest periods, lighting, and methods of pay at Western Electric Hawthorne plant. And this is a very famous example. Every management student generally read this in one or the other subject. The researchers found that workers' productivity increased whether the work hours were lightened or shortened. If they were being observed for 4 hours or for 8 hours or for 10 hours, their working speed was actually increased. Productivity was increased even if they were working for 4 hours a day, even if they were working for 10 hours a day. Their speed was good, very good. Productivity was good. Whether lighting was very bright or dim, whether they were providing with good lighting or not, their productivity was good. So whether they were provided with good rest intervals or not, their productivity was good. Why it happened? Even the investigators were surprised about this, but then they realized that the workers' morale was higher because they were aware of being part of a special experimental group. When you know that you are being watched, you try to behave nicely, you try to behave more productive, and automatically energy comes within, and you get motivated to behave nicely, you get motivated to work more productively than you generally do. So this totally unintended effect is now popularly known as Hawthorne effect, because researchers realized that subjects will perform differently when they know that they are experimental subjects. It generally happens whenever we know that we are being watched by someone, we try to behave nicely. So the same way, when we know that we are being watched for our performance and we might be rewarded or not, that is another thing, but we will be recognized. At least somebody might come and comment on us that whether you behave well or not, whether your productivity was good or not, then we try to be more productive and energy comes in automatically. Whether rest period was provided or not, whether you were provided with 1 or 2 times tea coffee or not, whether you were provided with very good facilities or not, you will be very productive. So this is actually Hawthorne effect is. But if one side is demand characteristics, which are basically, which comes up because of the experimenters bias, experimenters presence, or maybe because the group knows that they are being part of an experimental study. But when they don't know, when the subject doesn't know that he's being watched, or he doesn't know that his productivity is being calculated, then ethical issues comes up. How come ethical issues? Because it is the experimenter's duty to tell the subject that they are being watched. If you do not tell people that you are actually doing an experiment on them, then some ethical issues arise up. How? Because this is actually your duty to tell people that they are being watched and you are observing them, because sometimes the privacy issues also comes up. This is the major issue coming up these days, though this is like we share our information everywhere, even on WhatsApp, on Facebook, on every social media platform. We share almost everything. We even share photographs wherever we visit, right? We try to tell people that we are going there, we have visited this place, we are doing this and that, right? This is also a kind of ethical issue, but we do not notice it. But when somebody else is doing something to us, then we comes we try to notice these ethical issues. But yes, when suppose I am not a part of something, or maybe if I am not aware of being watched for an experimental study, and some data related to my personal life is there, then it is actually an ethical issue, and company should compensate in one or the other way. Experimental research must address privacy here, confidentiality, and accuracy of reporting, because these are the only issues: privacy of the respondent, of the subject, confidentiality of his information, not which you promise that it is not going to be leaked, and accuracy of reporting means you will be reporting everything accurately, you will not distort the data. This is very important, because privacy and confidentiality for subjects, and accuracy of reporting for the company as well, for the company for which you are actually doing the research. Researcher codes of conduct often suggest that experimental subjects should be fully informed and receive accurate information. Yet experimental researchers who know that demand characteristics can invalidate an experiment, because when you show when you tell subject about the research going on, you will face demand characteristics, you might face Hawthorne effect or Geneva peak effect. But if you don't tell them, then there is a concern of their privacy and confidentiality. In that case, what researcher can do is debriefing. Debriefing is actually the process of providing subjects with all the pertinent facts about the nature and purpose of the experiment after the experiment has been completed. Because when you are doing the experiment, at that time, to avoid demand characteristics, you can hide this particular thing from the subject that you are doing the study on them. But when the experiment has been completed, you should actually go and tell them what has happened, right? That you were experimenting something and the experiment is complete now. What does an experiment when does an experiment have internal validity? What do you mean by internal validity? The ability of an experiment to answer the question whether the experiment treatment was the sole cause of changes in a dependent variable, and did the manipulation do what it was supposed to do, whether it worked or not. So we will check it. Internal validity basically means whether whatever research you were doing, it was actually done completely accurately or not, right? Whether it is actually going to solve the purpose or not. There are some factors which influence your internal validity, and these are history, maturation, testing, instrumentation, selection, and mortality. We will discuss them one by one. History: specific events in the environment between the before and after measurement that are beyond the experimenter's control. For example, a major employer closes its plant in the test market area. For example, your company is doing some research right now. You have just tested the market. Pre-test and post-test means you will test your subject today, and then after implementing the experiment, you will be testing them after the experiment is complete. So when you tested them today, as a pre-test, it was good, it was all done. But in between pre-test and the post-test, while your experiment was going on, a major player of your industry, suppose closes the company, his plant, then you might get more customers because of that also. It's not because of the experiment, but because of the recent happening which has just happened, right? So this is something which really affect the experiment. So it is also a kind of extraneous variable when such things happen. Or maybe suppose a brokerage firm is conducting an experiment. If the stock market takes a steep drop just after beginning of the experiment, this event may jeopardize the validity of the experiment, and this is actually called a history effect. So due to history effect also, we get distorted results sometimes. Then maturation. Subjects change during the course of the experiment. So, this can actually happen because of two reasons. Subjects become tired, or maybe they become more knowledgeable. So they will be experiencing different things in that particular time period, and they will be replying differently because of their own experience, not because of your pre-test and post-test experiment. So sometimes it is because people have changed over time. That is also called process of maturation. This effect also comes up. So how to reduce that, we will talk about it also, that how can we reduce this. We can actually do things like we do not disclose much in pre-test, and we will be disclosing things at the time of post-test. That can also be done, though there are other methods also, but still it is a major thing, which happens in this. For example, during a day-long experiment, subjects may grow hungry, tired, or bored. That is also sometimes the reason. For example, you did a pre-test in the morning and you are going to do post-test afternoon, right? They might not be in the very good mood or something like that. It is not because of the experiment, but it is because of the long tired hours, right? So, or maybe in an experiment over a longer time plan, maturation may influence internal validity because subjects grow older and more experienced with time. So it depends whether it was because of being tired or bored, or maybe it was because of being more knowledgeable now. Next is testing. Testing, the before measure alerts or sensitizes the subject to nature of experiment or second measure. Yes, it happens most of the times in case when we do pre-test and post-test studies. Basically, questionnaire about the traditional role of women triggers enhanced awareness of women in an experiment. Yes, when you were doing pre-test of with the same questionnaire, women were not aware of a few things, but after doing the experiment they are being aware of them, and they might become more active till the time you will actually do the post test of that particular questionnaire. So this is also one of the things. The testing also sometimes affect the experiment negatively, testing of questionnaire. Then instrumentation. Changing in instrument result in response bias. Yes, after the test marketing basically is done, pre-test, post-test, these kind of the things are done for improvement of questionnaire as well, improvement of instrument as well. We call questionnaire as instrument when we talk about research designs. So new questions about women are interpreted differently from earlier questions now, right? So that is also a kind of problem which might affect the internal validity. Then selection. Yes, sample selection error because of differential selection comparison groups. Because sometimes it is like you might include one kind of people in one group, and all the homogeneous but different from that group people in another group. That also happens sometimes. Control group and experimental group is self-selected group based on preference for soft drinks. So sometimes these selection biases also comes up. Then mortality. Sample attrition, some subjects withdraw from the experiment. Yes, due to some reason which is not actually related to your experiment, people withdraw from the experiment. Maybe someone has shifted from one place to another and you might not be able to contact them now, right? The reason was not at all related to your experiment, but this would be affecting your experiment's internal validity now. For example, subjects in one group of a hair dyeing study marry rich widows and move to Florida. Yes, the person might move to another place, and that is actually not related to study, but it happens. Then when does experiment have external validity? What do you mean by external validity? Internal validity means that we are trying to check whether instrument we applied for the experiment worked well or not. But when we talk about external validity, we actually try to see that when we can generalize the results, whether we can generalize the results or not. For example, you randomly selected 10 companies and you studied on them. Maybe you have taken up one industry, for example steel industry, and 10 companies from steel industry were being experimented for one or the other reason. Now the question is whether you can actually apply the results on all the other companies in steel industry or not. That is the question. If it is a yes, then that means your experiment has external validity. If you cannot generalize the results to at least your industry, then it is not a good experiment. That means experiment does not have external validity. This generally happens because of two reasons. Experiment validity is the quality of being able to generalize beyond the data of an experiment or other subjects or other groups in the population under study. I discussed the example of steel industry. It is applied actually everywhere. If you have selected some population and you studied them, then generalization of that particular data can be applied to another population as well in living in some other area. If it is so, then experiment really have external validity. So it is not only about companies, it is about people as well. But because we are discussing business research here, so I discussed the example of companies. Then student surrogates. What do you mean by a student surrogate? Sometimes what we do is, especially in academics, we generally try to experiment or do experiments on students rather than actual respondents, actual subjects which should be involved in the experiment, because this is little this is really cost effective. That is why we choose student surrogates instead of actual subjects to be chosen in the experiment. So this is one reason why external validity doesn't come sometimes, because that might not be able to, because you might not be able to generalize the findings because of surrogates you have chosen. And second reason is trade-offs. Sometimes we do trade-off between internal and external validity. Naturalistic field experiments tend to have greater external validity, but sometimes to achieve more internal validity, we sometimes go with necessary arrangements and all that, all artificial arrangements, so as to achieve good results or some results little earlier, or maybe to achieve some internal validity. But while doing that, we lose external validity from the experiment. So these having external validity can be improved by avoiding these two things. Then how can internal validity be increased? By having control groups, random assignment, pre-testing and post-testing, and post-test only. Sometimes control groups can be assigned to the experiment. How can you assign control group to the assignment? For example, if you study a group of 100 companies, at that time their industry might be different or their industry might be similar. This can also affect your experiment. This can also affect actually the sales volume and everything you are going to search about. So you can have some maybe the age of the company or maybe the industry of the company as control group, so as to control their effect on your dependent variable. That generally increase internal validity. But you have to try to take all the variables in the group which are going to affect your dependent variable and make them as control group rather than independent or extraneous group. Random assignment. Sometimes you have to randomly select people or companies so as to increase internal validity. If we, sometimes we become judgmental while selecting the group, so you have to stop being judgmental while selecting your subjects. That also increase internal validity up to some extent. Pre-testing and post-testing, yes, due to pre-testing and post-testing also our subjects become more mature, or they become more aware. So either you can do one thing, that you do not change the instrumental design while pre-testing and post-testing, or you can do one more thing, that you do not disclose anything while pre-testing, and disclose things at the time of after you have done post testing. And you can actually include two different interviewers or experimenters, so that subject does not recognize the experimenter at the time of post testing or post test only. Or you can do something like that, that if your experiment allows, avoid pre-testing, so that you are just going to test people just once, and you will be getting accurate results. They are not being matured now, they are not being aware of the problem, they are not more educated now, so you will be getting natural results. So these can be the alternatives to increase internal validity. Some true false. This is all about internal and external validity. Number 1, people are most common test units in more business experiments. Yes, people are actually most common units, be it HR manager, be it managers of the company, be it random population, be it some voters, be it anything. I mean, when you talk about your competitors, when you talk about your consumers, when you talk about the suppliers, when you talk about the managers of the company, everybody is a human being. I mean, we are actually talking about people, be it HR manager of your own company, be it your customer, be it your future prospect customers, anything, but we are talking about people. So it is a yes. Second is the most common procedure to try to ensure that experimental and control groups do not differ from each other in important ways at the beginning of a research study is random assignment of subjects to treatment and control groups. Yes, it is true, 100% true. Actually, most common procedure is this. A confound in an experiment means that there is an alternative explanation beyond the experimental variables for any observed differences in the dependent variable. Yes, sometimes we call this as extraneous variable as well. Yes, it is true. Fourth is when subjects guess the purpose of an experiment, this creates a confound known as a bias effect. No, it is actually a demand effect. So it is a false. Next, one way to reduce demand characteristics is to tell subjects the purpose of the experiment so they will be more willing to participate honestly. No, it is actually going to increase the demand characteristics. So it is false. Sixth is a confound is an experiment deception involving a false treatment. Is it? No, this is actually a placebo effect. So it is false. Then last is the people administering an experiment must be aware of the experimental hypothesis. Is it? See, they must be aware of experimental hypothesis, but if we talk about demand characteristics, they should not know about it. One way to reduce demand characteristics is to use a blind experimental administrator who does not know the experimental hypothesis. And in most of the studies, we do this these days. So it is a false. Some questions. Number 1, discuss what is meant by demand characteristics and why they are concerned for researchers. Yes, you have to define what demand characteristics is, and you can just actually mention why they are a concern for researchers, because that creates some biases and which lead to, invalidate your internal validity. So you can discuss other issues as well. This actually creates some experimenters bias. Then second is discuss 4 ways of reducing demand characteristics. How would you how would you reduce demand characteristics? By using experimental disuse, or maybe isolating experimental subjects. You can isolate them, or use a blind experimental administrator, that is very common these days, or administer only one experiment treatment level for each subject. You can avoid pre-test and post-test, and you can actually avoid improving your questionnaire if you find it faulty in between the experiment. Then next is compare and contrast internal validity and external validity, and discuss which one is most important in experimental research. You have to define internal validity and external validity and why these are important. Researchers often trade between internal and external validity, but both of them are important. When it comes to laboratory experiments, we mentioned that internal validity are more important, because at least your experiment should be valid. Then we will be talking about the generalization of that particular result. Internal validity means experiment was good, you have used the experiment good, in a good way, in a proper way. External validity means once you have got the results, that can be generalized or not. Once first of all, achieving internal validity is important, because if you have not achieved internal validity, then achieving external validity is of no use. External validity comes after achieving internal validity, so it is more important in that ways. But both of them are important. Having both validity is very important in experimental group. That's it. Thank you. In next video, we will be discussing what are the basic experimental designs, and that would be the last video of unit 2. Thank you.